Let me ask you something. How long can 1,600 people hold a fortress against 100,000 soldiers? Not a day, not a week. How about 15 months? 15 months of constant bombardment, wave after wave of assaults, starvation so severe they're eating rats and boiling leather. How long before they break? The answer, as it turns out, is they don't break. You break them through politics and betrayal, not battle. This is the Siege of Shkodra, 1478 to 1479. A small Albanian fortress city on the edge of Europe, defended by a handful of Venetian soldiers and Albanian citizens against the largest army the Ottoman Empire could field. Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, the man who broke the walls that had stood for 1,000 years, threw everything he had at Shkodra. 100,000 men, hundreds of cannons, siege towers, the best engineers in the world. For 15 months, he tried to take one city defended by 1,600 people, and he failed. 30,000 Ottoman soldiers died, the defenders held, and in the end, Venice surrendered not because the city fell, but because they didn't want to spend any more money defending it. This is a story about what happens when you refuse to quit, about what ordinary people can do when their backs are against the wall. About betrayal, courage, and the ugliest kind of warfare, the siege that grinds both sides into the dirt until there's nothing left but corpses and rubble. And most importantly, it's about Albania's last stand, the final chapter of a resistance that had fought the Ottomans for half a century. Before we dive into exactly how 1,600 people held off 100,000 for over a year, here's what I need from you. If this story shows you something you've never heard about, if it proves that numbers don't always win, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what shocked you most, and subscribe because we're telling the stories that deserve to be remembered. No oversimplified heroics, no sugar-coated endings, just the siege, the suffering, and the truth. That's all I'm asking. Now let's go back 545 years and watch one of history's most stubborn defenses. To understand Shkodra, you need to understand Albania's situation in 1478. For decades, Albania had been led by Skanderbeg, George Castrioti, arguably the greatest resistance leader in European history. He'd spent 25 years fighting the Ottomans, winning battle after battle through brilliant tactics and sheer willpower. He turned Albania into the graveyard of Ottoman ambitions, inflicting tens of thousands of casualties. Mehmed II himself had tried and failed to defeat Skanderbeg multiple times, but in 1468, Skanderbeg died. And with him died Albanian unity. Albania fractured, local lords fought among themselves. The Ottomans saw their chance and pushed hard. Town after town fell. By the mid-1470s, most of Albania was under Ottoman control, but a few strongholds remained, and the most important was Shkodra. Shkodra sat in northern Albania, near Lake Shkodra, commanding the routes between the Adriatic coast and the inland Balkans. It was strategically critical. Control Shkodra, and you control access to the entire region. The city itself was built around a fortress on a rocky hill overlooking the Buna River. The fortress, called Rizafa Castle, had walls that had stood for centuries, not as impressive as Constantinople's walls, but solid, well-maintained, and positioned on terrain that made assault difficult. After Skanderbeg's death, Shkodra had fallen under Venetian control. Venice was a merchant republic, wealthy and powerful, with interests all along the Adriatic coast. They'd signed treaties with Albanian lords, providing money and troops in exchange for trading rights. When most of Albania fell to the Ottomans, Venice held onto Shkodra because it protected their trading routes. But Venice's commitment was economic, not ideological. They'd defend Shkodra as long as it made financial sense. Once the costs exceeded the benefits, they'd negotiate. The defenders of Shkodra in 1478 were a mixed force. About 1,400 were Venetian troops, professional soldiers, crossbowmen, and gunners. About 200 were local Albanian fighters, men who'd fought under Skanderbeg and refused to accept Ottoman rule. The commander was Antonio Laudano, a Venetian captain general appointed by the Senate. He was experienced, competent, and committed to defending the city. Under him were two other Venetian commanders, Pietro Mocenigo and Jacopo Barbarigo, both capable officers. The garrison was small but professional. The civilian population of Shkodra numbered a few thousand, mostly Albanians with some Venetian merchants and their families. When the siege began, many civilians fled. Those who stayed knew what they were facing. The Ottomans didn't negotiate with cities that resisted. Surrender early and you might get decent terms. Resist, and if they take you by storm, you're enslaved or killed. Shkodra chose resistance. Sultan Mehmed II had personal reasons for wanting Shkodra. He fought Skanderbeg and lost. He tried to conquer Albania and been bled white. Shkodra was the symbol of Albanian resistance, the last major fortress standing against him. Taking it would complete the conquest of Albania and eliminate Venice's foothold in the region. And Mehmed was not a man who tolerated defiance. He'd conquered Constantinople at age 21. He destroyed the Byzantine Empire. He'd expanded Ottoman territory into Anatolia, the Balkans, and Crimea. One small Albanian fortress was an insult to his legacy. In the spring of 1474, Mehmed had already tried once. He besieged Shkodra with about 80,000 men and heavy artillery. The siege lasted 4 months. The Ottomans bombarded the walls, launched assaults, tried to tunnel under the fortifications. The defenders held. Disease ravaged the Ottoman camp. Supply lines were harassed by Albanian irregulars. Mehmed lifted the siege in disgust and withdrew, but he swore he'd return. In 1478, he came back with everything. Ottoman sources estimate the army at 100,000 to 150,000 men. Modern historians generally accept a figure around 100,000, which was enormous for a siege. About 15,000 were janissaries and other elite infantry. 20,000 were cavalry. The rest were infantry, engineers, miners, and support troops. Mehmed brought over 200 cannons, including massive siege guns similar to the ones that had broken Constantinople's walls. He brought siege towers, battering rams, portable bridges, every piece of siege equipment available. This wasn't a raid. It was an industrial operation designed to erase Shkodra from the map. The siege began in May 1478. Ottoman armies surrounded the fortress, cutting it off from land. Ottoman ships blockaded the Adriatic coast, cutting off supply by sea. The only way in or out was through the Ottoman lines, which meant running a gauntlet of thousands of soldiers. Shkodra was isolated. The bombardment started immediately. Hundreds of cannons fired day and night. The sound was constant, a rolling thunder that never stopped. Stone cannonballs weighing hundreds of kilograms smashed into Shkodra's walls. Unlike Constantinople, Shkodra's walls weren't designed to withstand this level of artillery. Sections began to crumble within days. The defenders worked frantically to repair breaches, using rubble, timber, anything available. Every night, they rebuilt what the cannons destroyed during the day. Mehmed positioned his headquarters on a hill overlooking the fortress, where he could watch the siege personally. He wanted to see Shkodra fall. Ottoman engineers surveyed the walls, identifying weak points. Ottoman miners began digging tunnels, trying to undermine the foundations and collapse sections of wall. The defenders countered by digging their own tunnels, breaking into Ottoman mines, and fighting savage underground battles in the darkness. The first major assault came in June, after weeks of bombardment. Ottoman infantry attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, trying to overwhelm the defenders. Thousands of soldiers charged the walls carrying ladders, grappling hooks, and shields. The defenders met them with arrows, crossbow bolts, stones, and burning oil. Fighting raged along the walls for hours. Ottomans reached the ramparts in several places and were thrown back. Bodies piled up at the base of the walls. The assault failed. Mehmed ordered another assault a week later. Same result. And another. And another. Through June and July, Ottoman forces launched assault after assault. The pattern was always the same. Bombardment to create breaches, infantry charges to exploit them, desperate fighting on the walls and in the breaches. Ottoman casualties in the hundreds or thousands, defender casualties in the dozens, and the walls held. The mathematics were insane. The defenders were outnumbered roughly 60 to 1. For every defender on the walls, there were 60 Ottoman soldiers waiting to attack. In any normal siege, those odds meant quick defeat, but Shkodra's terrain and fortifications neutralized numbers. The fortress sat on a hill, forcing attackers to charge uphill under fire. The walls, though damaged, still stood, and the breaches, even when opened, were narrow choke points where the Ottomans couldn't bring their numerical advantage to bear. A dozen defenders in a breach could hold off hundreds of attackers if they fought well, and Shkodra's defenders fought like demons. Antonio Laudano was everywhere during the assaults, sword in hand, rallying troops, plugging gaps in the defense. He led counterattacks personally, pushing Ottomans back from breaches they'd nearly taken. He reorganized defenses on the fly, moving troops to threatened sections, ensuring no part of the wall was left undefended. Venetian discipline and Albanian desperation combined into a defense that absorbed everything the Ottomans threw at it. But sieges aren't won or lost in dramatic assaults. They're won through attrition. The Ottomans controlled the countryside. They had supply lines reaching back to Constantinople. They could replace casualties, bring up fresh troops, keep their soldiers fed. The defenders had what was inside the walls and nothing more. And Shkodra's supplies were not infinite. By August, food was becoming scarce. The garrison had stockpiled supplies before the siege, but not enough for 15 months. Rationing began, meat disappeared first, then bread, then grains. By September, the defenders were living on minimum calories, enough to keep them alive, but not enough to maintain strength. And the assaults kept coming. Men were fighting on empty stomachs, exhausted, watching their comrades die with no end in sight. Venice knew Shkodra was in trouble. The Senate debated sending reinforcements and supplies, but the Adriatic was blockaded. Ottoman ships patrolled the coast. Any relief force would have to fight its way through. Venice sent a small fleet in the summer of 1478. It broke through the blockade and delivered supplies to Shkodra, enough to keep the garrison going a few more months. But that was it. Venice made it clear they couldn't sustain regular supply runs. Shkodra was on its own. The defenders knew this. They knew Venice might abandon them. And they knew that if Shkodra fell, the Ottomans would show no mercy. The city had resisted. It had killed thousands of Ottoman soldiers. Maimed would make an example. Execution, enslavement, the city razed to the ground. Surrender was not an option. They had to hold until the Ottomans gave up or until relief came, one or the other. There was no third option. Through the fall of 1478, the siege ground on. The bombardment continued. Assaults came every few weeks. The defenders held every time, but the costs were mounting. Every assault killed or wounded defenders who couldn't be replaced. The garrison that started at 1,600 was shrinking. By October, it was probably down to 1,200 or 1,300 effectives, the rest dead, wounded, or too sick to fight. And the Ottomans kept coming. Winter brought some relief. The bombardment slowed because rain and mud made moving heavy guns difficult. Assaults became less frequent because winter weather was brutal for soldiers in the trenches, but winter also brought starvation. Food supplies were nearly exhausted. The defenders ate anything they could find. Rats became a delicacy. Leather belts and boots were boiled into a tasteless paste that kept people alive. Diseases spread in the overcrowded fortress. Dysentery, typhus, probably typhoid. People died from illness as much as from Ottoman weapons. The civilians suffered worst. Soldiers at least got priority for what little food remained. Civilians starved. Children died first, then the elderly. The strong held on barely. Sources describe people so emaciated they looked like skeletons. Eyewitness accounts, though sparse, paint a picture of hell. A fortress filled with dying people, holding out not because they thought they could win, but because surrender meant death anyway. And yet morale didn't break. The defenders knew what was at stake. This was Albania's last stand. If Shkodra fell, Albanian resistance was over. The Ottomans would control everything. Centuries of Albanian identity, culture, and independence would end. For the Albanian fighters in the garrison, this wasn't just about holding a fortress, it was about refusing to let their people disappear. In January 1479, the Ottomans tried something new. They'd been digging mines under the walls for months, but the defenders, countermining, had frustrated most attempts. Now Ottoman engineers dug deeper, farther, and placed massive quantities of gunpowder under a section of the main wall. In late January, they detonated it. The explosion was enormous. A section of wall 30 meters long collapsed completely, creating a breach the size of a city gate. The explosion killed dozens of defenders outright. Rubble filled the fortress interior. Dust and smoke choked everyone. The Ottomans attacked immediately. Thousands of soldiers poured through the breach, expecting to overrun the stunned defenders. They ran into a nightmare. Laudano had anticipated a mine explosion. He'd prepared fallback positions behind the walls, barricades of rubble and timber. When the wall collapsed, the defenders fell back to these positions and held. Fighting in the breach was close-quarters butchery, no room for tactics, just hacking and stabbing in the dust. The Ottomans pushed in. The defenders pushed back. Hours of fighting. The Ottomans took the breach, but couldn't advance beyond it. By nightfall, they withdrew, having gained a pile of rubble at the cost of hundreds dead. Over the next week, the Ottomans tried to expand the breach, bring up more troops, push deeper into the fortress. The defenders built new barricades every night, falling back layer by layer but never breaking. It was warfare at its most primitive. No cavalry charges, no grand maneuvers. Just men killing each other in confined spaces over piles of stone. And still, the defenders held. Maimed was furious. He'd been besieging this city for 9 months. He'd lost thousands of men. He'd fired tens of thousands of cannon shots. He'd blown up the walls. And 1,200 half-starved defenders were still fighting. His officers were getting nervous. Casualties were mounting. Disease was spreading in the Ottoman camp too. Morale was eroding. Some commanders quietly suggested lifting the siege. Maimed refused. He would take Siege of Shkodra if it took every man in his army. In March 1479, the Ottomans launched their largest assault yet. 20,000 men attacked the fortress from all sides simultaneously. It was supposed to be overwhelming, unstoppable. The defenders, now maybe 1,000 effectives, faced odds of 20 to 1. They held. For an entire day, fighting raged along every section of wall, at every breach, on every barricade. The defenders were out of arrows, out of crossbow bolts, out of everything except swords and desperation. They fought hand-to-hand, throwing stones when they ran out of weapons, using captured Ottoman equipment when their own broke. And they held. By nightfall, the Ottomans withdrew again. They'd gained nothing, but they'd killed maybe 200 defenders, and those losses, for a garrison already down to 1,000, were catastrophic. Laudano knew the next major assault would probably succeed. The defenders were at their breaking point. They were starving, exhausted, depleted. They'd performed miracles holding out this long, but miracles end. In Venice, the Senate was debating. Siege of Shkodra had held for nearly a year. It had inflicted massive casualties on the Ottomans and tied down their entire army. Strategically, it had done its job, but continuing the defense was costing Venice money and resources they needed elsewhere. Venice was fighting wars in Italy and against other rivals. Siege of Shkodra was a drain. Some senators argued for continuing the fight, honoring Venice's commitment. Others argued for negotiating, cutting losses, and getting the best terms possible. In April 1479, Venice sent envoys to Maimed to negotiate. The Sultan, also tired of the siege, was willing to talk. The negotiations were pragmatic. Venice would surrender Siege of Shkodra. Maimed would allow the garrison and any civilians who wanted to leave to evacuate safely. No executions, no enslavement. In exchange, Venice would cede other territories and agree to favorable trade terms with the Ottomans. It was a political deal that ignored the fact that Siege of Shkodra hadn't fallen. When word of the negotiations reached the defenders, they were enraged. They'd held for a year, they'd bled for this city, and Venice was surrendering, Laudano was furious. The Albanian fighters were furious. They wanted to keep fighting. They argued Shkodra could hold longer, that the Ottomans were on the verge of giving up. But Venice's orders were clear. Surrender was negotiated. Evacuation would proceed. The defenders could come out with honor, but they had to leave. In late April 1479, the garrison began evacuating. Venetian ships arrived under the terms of the truce and took off soldiers and civilians who wanted to leave. Some Albanian defenders refused. They walked out of the fortress, past Ottoman lines, and disappeared into the mountains to continue guerrilla resistance. Others accepted the reality and evacuated. Laudano was one of the last to leave, reportedly weeping as he abandoned the fortress he defended for 15 months. On April 25, 1479, Ottoman forces entered Shkodra unopposed. They found a fortress in ruins. The walls were rubble. Buildings were destroyed. Bodies were everywhere. The city itself was a corpse. Maimed rode in personally to claim his victory. He looked around at the devastation and the cost. 30,000 Ottoman soldiers had died in the siege, possibly more. It was one of the bloodiest sieges in Ottoman history. And he'd won not through battle, but through politics and negotiation. Maimed ordered Shkodra rebuilt as an Ottoman city. He settled Turkish families there, built mosques, and integrated it into the empire. The Albanian population that remained was gradually assimilated or pushed out. Shkodra became Turkish, part of the Ottoman system, and would remain so for 4 centuries. The defenders who evacuated went different directions. The Venetian troops returned to Venice and were reassigned to other garrisons. Some Albanian fighters joined other resistance movements. Others settled in Venetian territories in Greece or Italy, far from their homeland. A few returned to the mountains and fought on for years until age or Ottoman blades caught up with them. Laudano was received in Venice as a hero. The Senate honored him for his defense. But privately, many Venetians were angry he'd cost the Republic so much money for a city they ultimately surrendered. His career continued, but the shadow of Shkodra followed him. He'd done everything right tactically, but lost strategically because politics overruled military success. For Maimed, Shkodra was a Pyrrhic victory that haunted his final years. He won, but at immense cost, 30,000 dead. Over a year of his empire's military might tied down by 1,600 defenders. It was humiliating, and it damaged his health. Maimed was in his late 40s, exhausted from decades of campaigning. The stress of the siege, combined with other health issues, weakened him. In May 1481, just 2 years after Shkodra fell, Maimed II died. Some sources suggest he was poisoned, but disease or exhaustion are more likely. He'd conquered an empire, but died without seeing it stabilized. And one of his last memories was the year he spent trying to take a city defended by a force he outnumbered 60-1. For Albania, Shkodra's fall marked the end. The last major Albanian fortress was gone. The Ottoman conquest was complete. Albanian resistance didn't end immediately. Scattered fighters held out in the mountains for years, but organized resistance was over. Albania would remain under Ottoman control until the early 20th century. Let's analyze what actually happened at Shkodra. How did 1,600 defenders hold against 100,000 attackers for 15 months? The answer is terrain, fortifications, leadership, and desperation. Terrain first. Shkodra's fortress sat on a rocky hill that forced attackers uphill under fire. This negated numerical superiority because only so many men could attack at once. Narrow approaches, steep slopes, and defensive terrain meant the Ottomans couldn't bring their full force to bear. They had 100,000 men, but could only commit a few thousand to any given assault. Fortifications, even damaged, Shkodra's walls were effective. Stone walls several meters thick don't fall easily. The Ottomans could create breaches, but breaches are choke points. A dozen defenders in a breach can hold off hundreds if they're willing to die doing it, and Shkodra's defenders were very willing. Leadership. Laudano was competent, organized, and present. He kept the garrison disciplined through months of hell. He rotated troops. ensured repairs happened, led by example. Without effective leadership, sieges fall apart as units lose cohesion. Laudano held things together. Desperation. The defenders knew surrender meant death or slavery. They fought with nothing to lose. That kind of desperation makes men incredibly dangerous. They'll take risks no rational soldier would, hold positions that should be untenable, and refuse to quit when quitting is the logical choice. But the siege also shows the limits of defense. The defenders held the fortress but couldn't break the siege. They couldn't defeat the Ottoman army. All they could do was endure until either the Ottomans gave up or relief arrived. Neither happened. Venice negotiated instead. And no matter how brave the defenders, once their political masters decided to quit, the siege was over. There's a lesson here about the relationship between military and political success. Shkodra was a tactical success. The defenders held against impossible odds, inflicted massive casualties, and tied down an entire Ottoman army for over a year. But it was a strategic failure because the political will to continue didn't exist. Venice cut a deal. The defenders' suffering and courage meant nothing once the Senate decided it wasn't worth the cost. That's the tragedy of Shkodra. The defenders did everything right. They held when no one thought they could. They made the Ottomans pay for every meter. And in the end, they were betrayed not by military failure, but by political calculation. Venice weighed costs and benefits and chose to quit. The defenders had no say. Let's talk about the human cost. 30,000 Ottoman soldiers died. Most from assault casualties, disease, and exposure during a siege that lasted through summer, fall, winter, and spring. They died attacking walls that wouldn't fall, in trenches filled with mud and filth, from diseases that spread through overcrowded camps. Ottoman commanders sent wave after wave of men to die against Shkodra's defenses because maimed demanded it. For the defenders, casualties were probably 40–50% of the garrison. Starting with 1,600, likely 600–800 died during the siege, not just from combat, but from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. The civilians inside suffered even worse, with possibly half the initial population dead by the end. These were people who stayed because leaving meant abandoning their homes, their city, their identity. They chose to stay, and many paid with their lives. The psychological toll on survivors was immense. Soldiers who fought at Shkodra carried the memory for the rest of their lives. The constant bombardment, the assaults, the starvation, watching comrades die, it marked them. Some probably never fully recovered mentally. And the knowledge that after all that suffering, Venice negotiated a surrender must have been crushing. For the Albanians specifically, Shkodra's fall was existential. It was the last symbol of resistance, the last piece of Skanderbeg's legacy. When it fell, Albanian independence was over. For the fighters who'd held out, who'd believed they were defending not just a city but their people's future, the betrayal was total. Some kept fighting in the mountains, but they knew it was hopeless. They were ghosts of a resistance that had already lost. There's a detail that captures the siege's intensity. During one assault, Ottoman soldiers reached the fortresses in a courtyard, thinking they'd broken through. They found Albanian women and children armed with knives and stones, ready to fight. The women attacked, killing several Ottoman soldiers before being cut down. This wasn't military resistance. This was pure desperation, civilians knowing that if the Ottomans took the fortress, death or slavery awaited. That's the reality of siege warfare. It's not just soldiers fighting. It's everyone, including those with no training and no chance, fighting because the alternative is worse. Mehmed's obsession with Shkodra reveals something about his character. He was one of history's great conquerors, but he couldn't tolerate defiance. Shkodra should have been bypassed, left to starve, or taken with minimal effort. Instead, he committed enormous resources because it had resisted him. Pride drove the siege as much as strategy, and it cost him 30,000 men for a city that wasn't strategically critical enough to justify those losses. The Venetian decision to negotiate was rational but dishonorable. From a cost-benefit perspective, Venice made the right call. Shkodra had served its purpose tying down Ottoman forces and buying time. Continuing to defend it would cost money Venice needed elsewhere. But from the defenders' perspective, it was betrayal. They'd been promised support, told their defense mattered, and then abandoned when Venice decided the price was too high. That's the reality of being a client state. Your patrons will sacrifice you when convenient. The evacuation itself was surreal. Defenders who'd fought for 15 months, who'd held against everything the Ottomans threw at them, walked out of the fortress under truce terms and sailed away. Ottoman soldiers watched them leave, probably with a mix of relief and respect. These men had killed thousands of their comrades, but military culture often respects stubborn enemies. The defenders left with their weapons and banners, honors of war granted by the truce. It was more mercy than cities taken by storm usually received. Shkodra's legacy is complicated. Militarily, it was an extraordinary defense, one of the longest and bloodiest sieges of the medieval period. Strategically, it was ultimately meaningless because Venice surrendered. Politically, it ended Albanian independence. But culturally, it became a symbol. For Albanians, Shkodra represented resistance, the refusal to submit even when submission was inevitable. For centuries under Ottoman rule, Albanians remembered Shkodra as the last time they'd fought as a nation. Modern military analysts study Shkodra as an example of how defenders can hold against overwhelming numbers through terrain, fortifications, and will. The siege demonstrated that numerical superiority alone doesn't guarantee victory in siege warfare, but it also demonstrated that no defense lasts forever without relief or resupply. The defenders could hold but not win. Eventually, something gives. If you're still watching, I want to know what you think. Could the defenders have held longer if Venice had supported them? Was the Venetian decision to negotiate justified? And what would have happened if Shkodra had actually held until Maimed gave up? Drop your answers in the comments. Let's debate this properly. And if this story showed you something you didn't know, if you appreciate military history that respects both the courage and the tragedy, hit that subscribe button. We are building a community that values real history. Not oversimplified, not romanticized, but real. The kind where people suffer and die, and sometimes their suffering means nothing because politics overrules everything. That's history. That's what we do here. Shkodra matters because it shows the gap between military and political success. The defenders won every tactical engagement. They held against impossible odds. They made the Ottomans pay a price no other siege had extracted, and none of it mattered because Venice decided to cut a deal. Courage doesn't beat politics. Stubbornness doesn't beat economics. And 1,600 people, no matter how brave, can't win a war when the people funding them decide to quit. That's the real lesson of Shkodra, not that defenders can hold forever if they're brave enough. But that defense, no matter how heroic, eventually runs into the cold mathematics of resources, political will, and strategic priorities. The defenders of Shkodra did the impossible, and it wasn't enough, because in the end, wars are won by nations, not fortresses. And when the nation decides the fortress isn't worth it anymore, the fortress falls, not to assault, but to accountants and diplomats. Now you know what happened at Shkodra, not a glorious last stand that saved the day. A desperate, brutal 15-month siege where 1,600 people held against 100,000, inflicted 30,000 casualties, and were ultimately surrendered by their own allies. You know why Albania's last fortress fell, why Maimed's victory was hollow, and why courage alone can't win wars. That's the story they don't teach. The one where the heroes lose not because they failed, but because someone else decided they weren't worth saving. That's what we do here. Real history. The kind that hurts because it's true, and there are more stories coming. More sieges, more battles, more moments where everything went wrong or right for reasons no one expected. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.